Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for this Evolving HR webinar. This is the second one of these that we've done, and I don't know if excited is the right word for the topic that we're covering today, but this feels like a necessary conversation rather than an exciting conversation. So I'm going to start off by letting my guests introduce themselves today. So I'm joined by Deborah Corey, Neil Lawrence, and Jules Gordon. So Deborah, do you want to say hi to everybody and just tell them a little bit about who you are?
Sure. So hello, everyone. You did tell me to do that, and I'm in HR, so I follow instructions. I have been in HR for over 20 years, worked in a lot of different companies, industries, countries, all of those types of things. But for the last 5 years, I've been the Chief Pay It Forward Officer, completely made up that title, at my own company, Debco HR. And I'm all about challenging the status quo, shaking things up and trying to get people to think and act differently. So I was really excited and honored to be invited today.
Wonderful. Thank you. Neil, tell everybody who you are.
I'm Neil. I'm a business coach. I know, slight pause. A neurodivergent business coach who works with leaders and HR professionals and neurodivergent professionals generally, but young professionals particularly. The HR piece came to me as really important when I started doing my coaching, because I was finding that that's where the block was often, and that's who was shouldering all the burden. So I'm really, really pleased to be here. Not happy about the topic either, but I'm really glad to kind of be able to do some thinking with people here today. Oh, I'm a fiction writer too. Okay.
And finally, oh yes, you are a fiction writer as well. And Deborah is a non-fiction writer. How many books have you written now, Deborah? Is it 6?
I've written 6, but Neil, when I retire, I want to write a fiction. I already have my idea for a mystery book, so I'll be coming to you.
Excellent.
Oh, that's cool. Jules, tell us a bit about you.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm a wannabe writer. I've not written a book yet, so it's on my to-do list. I'm a corporate escapee, actually. I've spent quite a long time, a couple of decades in all things HR, leading people teams, both in private equity and large corporate businesses. This topic is near and dear to me. I've gone in to many a toxic workplace. I've worked for some toxic leaders, actually, so that's probably all going to come out as part of this. Nowadays, I do workplace mediation, exec coaching, and I do some board advisory work. So I'm typically called in to help fix problems such as the one that we're going to talk about today. So really looking forward to this conversation.
That's brilliant. I mean, and there is a reason that I've asked these 3 people in particular to be my guests today. I feel like, so the guests for these webinars are all providers in the Evolving HR app, but when I'm selecting those that I want to be involved in each webinar, I'm thinking about not only their own experiences, but also the work that they do now. So I would imagine that the vast majority of providers have experienced a toxic workplace, but I've got a mix of people here today who have experienced it, helped to fix it, caused it, all of those sorts of things. So there was a nice mixture here in a very deliberate choice of guests. So obviously we are talking about toxicity at work, not just individual toxic managers, but also toxic cultures, which, as I said at the start, unfortunately, I think many of us will have experienced. So I want to kick things off, and I'm going to come to you first on this one, Deborah. But what do you think, or how would you describe some of the indicative signs of a toxic environment at work?
Yeah, I mean, if I just get to the core of the word toxic, I mean, there's so many different definitions of toxic, but things like poisonous, unpleasant, harmful, and I'm sure we all can picture situations when those things were happening to us, to our people, being in HR, taking care of people when it was toxic. And again, I think we've all experienced some of the signs, whether it's from a data perspective, So good old surveys, engagement surveys, turnover. So there's lots of data that can be indicative of a toxic environment. But for me, being in HR and now being a consultant, it's what does it feel like? What does it look like? How are people walking around? What are they saying? What are they doing? The book that we just wrote is called Bad Bosses Ruin Lives, and they definitely are causing toxic environments. And they're causing these things to happen, low engagement, low motivation. Even from a well-being perspective, one piece of data found that the leading cause of well-being and stress is your boss, not your partner, not your children, even though sometimes it could be, but it is your boss. So yeah, lots of indicative signs there.
Yeah. And Neil, would you add anything to that?
I'm thinking about not necessarily the outward signs, but some of the inward signs, things that can be easy to miss, like the extra colds, like the constant stiff neck, the increase in irritation when you're, well, at home or at work, and the things that can just build and build until it can get to a point where suddenly you turn around and you're in a space and in a place you don't want to be, and the toxicity is really kind of impacted to that degree.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
I was going to say, I think there's one thing when you walk into a toxic workplace and it takes all of about 30 seconds to spot. When you look around and everybody is a shade of corporate grey. So you have the difference in colour. There is no colour in their cheeks. It's all drained. But I would also say interference with the moral compass. What does it feel like for an individual? Sometimes there's that feeling inside and running interference constantly too.
Yeah. And I've seen it in the
It's
work.
really interesting, actually. Go on, Deborah.
No, I was just going to say, I've seen it in the work that people do also. So, you go to a meeting and you're working with a group where it's very toxic and the work is very mediocre. I'm going back to gray. It's very gray. And you can tell when there's a group of people who are motivated, engaged. Everything is just so creative and colorful. So I do like that definition of gray. So sorry about that, Kirsty.
And it's funny, actually, isn't there? Because there's a whole, and I use the word spectrum a lot because it applies to so many things that we talk about, but there is a spectrum of toxicity. So there is, and it has different impacts on different people. So there, I know that, Neil, I know that you were very badly affected at work. It's actually affected your health by, bullying behavior is probably an extreme end of toxicity, but there's also that kind of, less easy to pinpoint and measure, that, like Jules said, it's that sort of general sense that this is not a good environment. And some of it is to do with engagement, and some of it is to do with leadership style, and some of it is absolutely to do with bullying. There's a real range of that. I don't know, Neil, if you wanted to talk about that at all, but did you want to talk about the extreme side of it, the bullying side of it?
It sounds weird saying I'm happy to do that, but I am, and I'm very transparent with my clients about it as well. So I was in education for 20 odd years, and by the end of it, I'm not claiming education gave me fibromyalgia. I think that's a step too far. I do think that a chronic condition like that is definitely exacerbated, especially when it's nerve ending related, which I have. By the end of it, I was walking with a stick all the time, and I had the worst symptoms of fibro that a person can have. Obviously, you don't shake that off. I've still got it now. But crucially, about 3 months after, I was working with a coach who's also a counsellor as well, a therapist, and who works with trauma people. And she said, do you think you've got PTSD? And I said, don't be ridiculous. And I've got a psychotherapy master's myself. I completely missed that element of the course, which is also interesting. Anyway, we did the test, and absolutely. So I've left with PTSD, and that's the result of all of the combination of things you were talking about, Kirsty. It is partly the very overt, consistent bullying that has you scared for your life, which is from leaders, I hasten to add, nothing to do with kids, But then crucial, it's also the everyday, almost kind of, you just notice it, the way people frame things, that becomes normalized. That's actually not good for anybody's health. So yeah,
that's absolutely.
Yeah.
It's horrible. I mean, what at the time when you were in the midst of that, were there any strategy? I can't say the word today. Strategies that you found effective in handling that kind of behavior towards you?
That's a really good question. There's a couple of things I'd say about that. The first thing is that I don't think it's easy, and I'm thinking about people I've worked with too, because I don't think it's easy to leave that situation until you're well enough to do that. So when you are right at the bottom of it, with some of the most potentially significant symptoms that you might have, some of which might be really worrying for those people that are really there, you can't necessarily leave. It's only when you have enough energy recovered. So things that I found helpful, I started meditation then, although I use mindfulness a lot more now, but I found that then when I was using that, I was suspicious of friends and family, but I did manage to have enough people around me to give me enough support that I would let them, because I wouldn't really let them in. I did kind of attend hospital stuff, and I was keeping an eye on my health. I think I had all the right things in place. It just wasn't necessarily leaning into them. So I think just getting yourself ready, and also trusting yourself that you will have the ability to know when it's time, and to have that question in your mind: is it time yet to go? Is it time yet to go? And setting up a future plan for what else you could do, not to hear the "you're no good at anything, you'll never get another job," which, you know, or the public sector one, which is often, don't go into the private sector, they'll eat you alive, as you're being eaten alive in the public sector. So I mean, I think there's something around that. Not all public sector, I hasten to add, obviously.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Deborah, what would you add to that in terms of strategies for handling toxic behavior?
Yeah, well, first thing I wanted to mention is that when I interviewed people for our book, we had many stories, not the same as Neil's, but, you know, stories, very traumatic stories of things that happened to people. And we used the phrase bad boss stress disorder, because you are right. Once you are in that situation, it can be really difficult and challenging. And I'm going to actually defend bosses for a minute, believe it or not, because I do think that there are all levels of toxicity and all levels of bad bosses. And in talking to many people, and actually my situation that I had with my bad bosses, I wish what I would have done is paused, stepped away, as you said, Neil, and try to understand what was causing them to act the way that they did. Because what I found out afterwards is that my boss was under this horrible stress and a lot of pressure. And I'm not defending them for how they treated me, but I've heard a couple other people say that as well. So sometimes stepping away, trying to, you know, put yourself first to recover, but then also try to understand it from the other person's perspective and see if, you know, get that understanding. So I had one person tell me that they had this horrible boss and the things that they told me that their boss did, and then they ran into them about 3 years later and had the nerve to tell them. And they said that their boss broke into tears saying, "I never knew I did that. Why didn't you tell me that?" Which takes bravery and courage. But yeah, I'd throw that into the mix.
Wow, that is interesting. Gosh, I always used to put it down to a couple of things with some of the people that I work with in my HR career, and it was usually people that couldn't manage stress very well or were a little bit out of their depth. That seemed to be, you know, their way of coping with feeling out of their depth themselves seemed to be to lash out at others. And that's something that I found fairly frequently. Jules, anything that you would add there in terms of strategies?
Yeah, I'm smiling here because I think I've been at the end of the spectrum that Neil is, and that's nothing to smile about. But equally, when Deborah said, you know, there are varying levels, and that really resonated. And the reason why it resonates and it makes me smile is if I go back, gosh, over 20 years ago, I came back from maternity leave. My boss had changed. She had a reputation in the organisation that I was in. The organisation had seemingly moved a problem, and this person was really quite a character. To step away from that toxicity. The organisation was large enough that I was able to apply for other roles and move internally. But from that day to this, and she shall remain nameless, but every time I've had a complex problem or something like that, I thought, what would X do? And I'll do exactly the opposite, because that's the answer. And actually that served me really, really well. So on the lighter end, sometimes I think if we kind of stop and we get ourselves out of a situation, there is a learning to be had, when you're in those situations. So that's why I was smiling as you were saying that. I'm like, yeah, at the lighter end, I ran for my life, and I've used her as my example forevermore.
Oh my gosh. I mean, yeah.
Sorry. I was just going to jump on what you said, Kirsty, before about stress and everything, because I share a story in my book about my alter ego. Don't know if anyone else has an alter ego. So when I get really stressed, Debbie comes out. And the way that I dealt with it with my team, and I share this very embarrassing, silly story, is that I just told them, Debbie's going to come out. What should we do? And they gave me a sign, and they said, every time Debbie's there, put it on your door, or now that we're virtual, put it on your Hangouts or whatever, and just warn us. And then we can decide whether or not we want to approach you or just wait until Deborah's back again.
I like that. I can't imagine having had that conversation with any of the oil traders I worked with over the years, how that would have gone down with them, but I do like that. Jules, let me stay with you for a second. So people talk a lot about boundaries.
Yeah.
And I love the concept. I think it's a great concept, but it's not something we all find easy. And even sometimes when we set them, we don't stick to them. So what kind of practical steps would you advise around setting boundaries to kind of protect yourself from some of this stuff?
Yeah. I mean, I've always had 2 phones. To this day, even though I run my own business, I've got 2 phones, and that will always be the way forward for me, because one can go off and I choose to look at it if I want to. The other stays on. That's the emergency hotline. I've always done that. That helps separate things. Where it didn't work so well was when I worked for somebody who obtained my personal number from my CV and continually contacted me with that. So I actually put them on a list that didn't show up. You can kind of put them on do not disturb. I always block out lunch. Whether I eat it or not is another thing, but if I go for a walk, then winning at life. And I always make sure that I lace up my trainers and go and lift something heavy. I would rather go and do CrossFit or something like that. I'm a nicer person to be around. I work by far better. If those things start getting compromised, then it's a domino effect. Everything falls apart. So whatever your thing is, whether it's yoga, fresh air, CrossFit, running, reading, just taking a step away. And that's the other thing. I mean, I drink so much coffee. I'm not kind of suggesting that everybody does that, but it's because I get up every hour and I go and I refill the coffee cup. So I'm wired most of the time. But all of those different things, whatever it is that works for the individual like that. But I can't recommend 2 phones more strongly, to be honest. So,
and I was just saying that, it's making me think, like, do you think that some of that is down to just connecting ourselves back to who we are outside of work? And so by doing whatever the thing is that makes you feel more like you and isn't to do with work, that kind of just helps you reset a bit?
Yeah, I think it puts you in a different zone. I think where I didn't do that, I will fall into work and I don't stop. And what that means is if you're working with somebody that will just take advantage of that, then you're quite easily sucked into a space that it's very, very hard to get out of. And I've been in that space and it's not very good. I've also been in the space where I'm very transparent with the team that I work with. I always put what I'm doing in my diary, whether that's a hair appointment or whatever. But when somebody sees it that wants to take advantage and go straight over the top of all of that, another coping mechanism is don't put it in your diary, and funnily enough they won't go over the top of it, but just tell people that you need to know. So there are workarounds, but yeah, it's about stepping away and resetting and kind of focusing on who I am. The person that I had to present as for a very, very long time in corporate land was not me. And, you know, you just need that space to be yourself, be who you are. And, you know, all the things that people don't know about you, I'm that person. I am the person with tattoos on my arm, you know, not that anybody would have ever seen that, because my word, you know, that was all covered up. So yeah, it's that. It's really, really important. Boundaries. And set an alarm. Failing everything else, 10 minutes before you need to be somewhere, put the alarm on the phone, and then that's it, done.
Brilliant. Yeah. I mean, it is those simple things, but they're the easiest ones to forget because they're simple. Deborah, would you add anything there in terms of boundaries?
Yeah, just adding on to what you said, Jules, I think you have to be intentional about it. So I think the trick for me is, to your point, I put it in my schedule, like, you know, and I give myself goals. Like, I know it sounds really silly, but like, I'm going to do, I just ran into a neighbor when I was doing my walk around the block at lunch. I'm going to do an art class with the people in my village. I'm going to do things that, you know, I wouldn't normally try, just to create it, just to separate myself and to give me something fun to look forward to and make sure that I do step away. I just did a talk for a company on it's okay to switch off. Yeah. And I learned so much. I'm like, I wish I had thought of that earlier. But, you know, the whole talk, it's amazing that we spent a whole hour just talking about the importance and how to switch off. And I would just challenge everyone to take a step back and think about, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. Neil, anything to add there?
Yeah, that really set me alight, actually, that question. Stop me if you need to. So I was just interested about this idea of boundaries, that we talk about it as if we're protecting ourselves, that we're starting from a premise that we need to protect ourselves from something outside that's attacking us, which is very, you know, increasingly the way that I think lots of us see the world all the time. I think people are very suspicious of each other, full stop, which is having, you know, very interesting ramifications in the workplace. But so it's that if we're starting from the I need to protect myself, what does that do? What does that set up psychologically anyway, and emotionally, rather than what am I allowing, you know, and what doesn't feel comfortable, we should, to name it. So if there's things kicking off late at night, we'll be getting requests, for example, to actually say that's not acceptable. It's not okay for us to be talking about this right now. I was thinking about the fact that it should be about us being all together, whereas very often with the boundaries piece, we end up talking about that lot there and othering here, and it's me and them, or them and us, and it's not about we. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of problems in a lot of organisations. Absolutely being ourselves, being real. There's a concept called emotional labour, which is about the amount of emotions that we have to give in the workplace to turn up and do our job that we'd never give any credence for. So being aware of that, if I'm going to have a day like this, I'm going to need a bit of this, and having a conversation with somebody like that makes me feel like this. How can I keep myself prepared and safe for that? That goes with the masking stuff. Makes me think of neurodivergent people I work with, and myself as well, about how to kind of negotiate the so-called neurotypical world. Core values, being in touch with those, I think is really helpful, because if we know who we are, then that can really help. And finally, I think what boundaries are respectful spaces where we feel safe, and encouraging other people to be part of that.
You've set me off now. We talk about boundaries, and all of the things that you've all just mentioned are brilliant. One of the things for me, and I think Neil, you've just covered this in a few different ways. The biggest boundary that I ever put in place for myself was being very, very clear about what I wouldn't put up with, and training myself to say no. And like I said, you know, I worked in commodities trading. Traders can be difficult. Some of them are absolutely lovely. I don't think a single one of these webinars is going to pass without me mentioning oil traders, because they've given me so many examples in so many different areas. But I was regularly screamed at by people who were stressed, and, you know, millions of dollars at stake. I get it, but that's no excuse for being downright rude to people. But that happened to me. There were people that screamed at me or shouted or even threw things. I've had that in the past. In pretty much every company I ever worked in as an HR professional. And I took it and I took it and I took it all through my 20s, my 30s, and some of my 40s. And I started changing the way that I responded to things at work and the way that I showed up at work only in about 2019 after I got let go from a company. And ever since then, I've been like, enough now. I won't put up with that anymore. And it's been the single biggest change I've made. So since then, I've worked in a couple of HR roles, and I had a situation where a CEO started screaming at me on a Zoom call. And I, at this point, was 47. For the first time in my life, I held my hand up to the screen and I went, please don't talk to me like that. And he just stopped dead in his tracks, because I don't think anyone had ever said that to him before. And it's really weird. I would love to be able to help other people build the confidence to do that. I don't know where it came from, but once you've done it once, you can do it again. And it's like, I have said to people, like, if you aren't able to calm down your tone, if you can't like lower your voice, I'm going to hang up the call. Back in the days of phone calls, I'm going to hang up the call and we can talk again later. And so sometimes just that voice of reason in the middle of that anger or that emotional exchange, it stops them. I don't know if it would work for everybody. I've now done it with 4 different people and it's worked every time. But, that for me is also, particularly when you're dealing with, really negative individuals, very emotional, and, I'll use the word toxic, to just say, hang on a minute. Would I put up with this if someone did this in Sainsbury's? No, I wouldn't. So why do I think it's okay to put up with it at work? And I do think we put up with more at work from people than we would in most other situations in our life, which is really interesting. But yeah, learning to draw your line and say, enough now.
Do you think though that some of that learning comes from some of the experiences that perhaps we've all been through, all of us on this call? Because I think probably early on, if I kind of time travel backwards, would I have had the courage or been brave enough to use my voice in the way that I use it now? Absolutely no way.
Yeah, no,
but would I want anybody to experience the stuff that, collectively we've all experienced? No way. Right. So some of that comes from what your journey, doesn't it, and what you've been through.
100%. It's interesting because if I look at myself, I've actually pushed back my entire life. I've gotten better at it though. I think it's just my personality, and funnily enough, my daughter's like that also. And I think both of us, we sort of see our role as defenders. So the reason I do it is I thought, forget about me. I don't do it for myself. I don't want anyone else to be treated like that. So I get myself into trouble quite a bit, I have to say. We were on the train and my daughter jumped in and told somebody, you really shouldn't do this, because she was worried about the other people. And I think if we can sort of look at it that way, because sometimes it's uncomfortable when we're defending ourselves. But if we think about, if we stop this one person, they are not going to yell at the next 20 people who might not have the courage to help them. Again, I wasn't very eloquent at it in my 20s and 30s and got into a lot of trouble, but I have been like that my whole life.
And sorry, Kirsty.
Sorry, go on, Neil.
That really resonates with me as well. And so where I'm at the moment, I'm only beginning this, and I'm not in for a minute. I'm not suggesting anybody does this, but if bringing curiosity to a situation like that, no, this is the opposite of that. I've done all that. It's the thinking. What would make someone get to the point where they're screaming at me across the screen? What's going on for them? I don't mean I want to make it better for them. They're ruining my day. At best, they're ruining my day. At worst, they're giving me, a very serious anxiety attack. What is going on for them that makes them feel that they have no control over how they are being so aggressively reactive in that moment? And that wouldn't be something that I bring into that second. I might need to just get the hell out of that room or that call right there and then. But certainly something, if I was strong enough, I'd want to go back to that person and go, because At best, it would make them think. At worst, they would absolutely hate it if they're reliant on role. The worst thing you could do. So I mean, it's a win-win either way. You either get up their nose, or you go, actually, if you're behaving in that kind of way, that you know, what's going on for you? Because nobody in your position should be talking to people like that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's an interesting couple of comments in the chat section at the moment. So Deborah's husband is here. Hi, Ken. And Ken's made the point that the current market conditions make it much harder to use our voice, however deserved. And yeah, I think there's a fear element there, isn't there? Like, what might the consequences be here for me if I do answer back? And I know certainly in organizations that I've worked in, these people are almost given a sort of a deference and a power because they're in senior roles, and that kind of behavior just gets left. And so you kind of fear saying anything in case there are repercussions. I don't know. Do you think the current market conditions make it worse, or has that always been there?
I would say it's always been there. But, you know, do we hear more now? I mean, I guess the way that we're all connected, we work differently now. Yeah, so perhaps it's enhanced.
Yeah, I think the job market's quite tight, so that's why people are afraid. And I know that, like in my bad boss situation, I stayed much longer because I was the sole provider. My husband was staying at home taking care of the kids, and I thought, I can't walk away. But in hindsight, I realized that I was putting myself, you know, Kelly talks about burnout all the time. I was putting myself in, you know, a really, really difficult situation, which could have had a bad ending. So I think sometimes the short-term loss of walking away and having no income, actually from a long-term perspective, probably took me a year to recover emotionally and physically from it. So you sometimes have to balance it and, you know, maybe do something a bit different while you're looking for another job.
But it comes back around to what Neil said, and having the strength and being brave enough. You know, you get to that point, don't you? So
you do.
Yeah,
you do.
One more thing just to lob in, unless you want to move on, guys. I don't
no, go for it. Go for it.
So the other thing that's really interesting, or I'm thinking about, is aggressive reactive behavior, because that's also a hallmark of trauma, and I use the word in its proper sense of the words, not the current throwing it at everything. So I was thinking about, so what was happening for me in the workplace a couple of times was that I had PTSD episodes. I had no idea they were there. I don't think that's a safe thing for me to be doing. I looked like I was the world's most angry, abusive human being. But in actual fact, I had no control over it. I mean, I still get them now, but I know they're coming in and I've done a lot of work. So, so sometimes we shouldn't be on the receiving end of it. We shouldn't be seeing it, but there's something systemic about and in really toxic workplaces, I think that kind of behavior, because I wasn't the only one that was doing that. They call them meltdowns, don't they? You know, oh, that person's having a meltdown. But it's a really indicative sign of people not being able to cope. So there's something around that part of it. It still doesn't make it acceptable for the person who's on the receiving end of it. I'm definitely not saying that, you know, having been on receiving end of stuff as well, I'm not saying that. But it makes it even more complicated, more like, how do we create workspaces so that appropriate behavior is normalized, and that the desire to feel things like aggression or when we're overcome by those, we feel confident enough to know to walk away from it. So we get off the call, even if we see and go, I'm really sorry, I can't have this conversation with you right now. This, you know, I need to deal with this. I'll come back to you. XXX, and get trained to do that too, if it's that high pressure a job.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to bring it into the, you know, obviously this conversation is designed for HR professionals. And I feel like we are, as HR professionals, in a fairly unique position, because you are not only responsible for employee well-being, and people will come to you if there's a toxic environment, but as we've talked about, you can experience it personally as well. So, Deborah, any thoughts on how somebody might be able to manage that conflict of interest when you're responsible for others, but you're also experiencing it? What advice would you have for HR professionals in that regard?
Yeah, I do think in HR we always have to wear two hats, don't we? The personal and the business side. And I think, for me, the first step is what we've all been talking about, is just trying to understand where the toxicity is coming from, what it is, and put on my business partner hat and get out there, talk about it, understand it, figure out what the underlying problems are. I know I was working with a company once where we were designing their values, and they were talking about, the toxic environment. And we had a lot of naysayers say, we're going to have these great values, but nothing's going to change. And it was like, well, what are we going to do collectively to change it? I'm in HR, but I'm not going to be the one to change it. And really to, again, understand the problem and then put in place programs and support so that collectively we can change it. Because one person, little old me, all 4'11" of me, is not going to change the world. I need people around me to drive it and to overcome it.
Mm. Jules, how about you? Because I know you worked as HR as well internally, didn't you, before you set up on your own? What are your thoughts there about that kind of split dynamic?
I was thinking as you were talking there, Deborah, because I often remind myself of what a lawyer said to me once. Actually, I was in the most horrific situation, and he said to me, "What would you be advising others, Jules?" And he knew what the answer was. And I went, "Oh." And he said, "So why don't you value yourself enough?" And it really struck a chord with me, because I found myself making excuses for this other person who was behaving abysmally. And actually, I was on the end of that, and it was really quite serious and really horrible in a stalkery kind of way. So it wasn't very nice. And I thought, yeah, actually, I know, right? And so I'm like, no, so now what I do is I think, well, hang on a minute. If I'm in that situation, what would I be advising somebody else? It kind of helps me personally take a step back from it. But being in this situation that I was in most recently, when I escaped corporate life, I perhaps didn't take that step back as soon as I could have done, because I was embroiled in a situation with all sorts of different things going on. And every now and again, you need a little reminder, but you also need to be brave enough. But yeah, it's what would you be advising someone else would be my thing.
Yeah. And Neil, just to kind of expand on that, if somebody is like working in HR and they don't know who internally they can talk to about a situation like this, what thoughts do you have on, other avenues for assistance or support?
It's very much some of the conversations that we're having at the moment, Kirsty, and is something that I'm, as someone who hasn't been an HR professional, I'm feeling an enormous amount of passion and need to try and support people who are. So there's two words that come up for me. One is isolation and one is vulnerability. The context of HR being such that you're open to everybody in an organisation being happy or unhappy or judging your performance all the time. You're always on show. And isolation in the sense that you sit outside of the organisation, although you are completely within it. So I think I think there probably are a lot of people who really haven't got anyone to talk to, or there isn't anyone safe for them to talk to.
I think that was something that I always experienced, was like, I can't complain about these people because I am the voice of the company and I have to toe the party line, kind of thing. And I think, had I had then the network that I have now, the community that I have now of other HR professionals, things would have been very different. But those communities didn't exist 20 years ago. I think about some of the Facebook groups and online communities and in-person communities that I'm now aware of that have pretty much all been set up in the last 5 years or so. There are lots of avenues out there now where we can talk to other HR professionals who have experienced the same kind of yuck that we have, but it's that acceptance that the support does not have to come from within your own organization. In fact, it probably won't. Sorry, just seeing Nikki's comment pop up. The more senior you are in HR, the harder it gets. Absolutely true. I work with a lot of standalone HR professionals, and I always say, if you're the only one or the most senior one, you've got to maximize your external network of HR professionals. You have to have that community, even if it's just to go, has anyone had to deal with this before? Just that outlet, because you cannot do it internally. Jules, what would you add to that? I mean, in terms of support opportunities, avenues, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, I do workplace mediation, and whilst I'm not here to plug that, that is actually an avenue and a resource. And I do often get called in wearing that hat into situations. And what you'll typically find is that more often or not, both parties have pretty much the same goal. It's just they don't know how to communicate with one another anymore. Things have got so bad that actually it really doesn't matter whether they were both agreeing with one another in person. They would argue against each other. So I see a lot of that. And sometimes people just want a neutral party to listen to them and to hear, because that's not happening in their own environment more often or not. Or coming right back to where we started at the very beginning, we spoke about some of the signs of a toxic workplace. And so that trust is gone. So they don't know who to trust. So you can't really have a conversation. Then you start getting paranoid. It's like, well, do I just test this by saying that to that person and then seeing where it goes? So all of that comes up. But those other types of resources, whether it's mediation, whether it's coaching, but somebody that's external to the environment, I would say is really important.
It's interesting. When I started out, I had a boss, and it completely changed the way I thought for 20 years, who said, anytime I try to go and talk to people externally or do a network, he said to me, isn't that what I hired you for? Aren't you supposed to be the one with all of the answers? And it took me a little while to get over it. And I'm completely with you, Kirsty. I wish that those communities that are out there today were there. But it's interesting because the people who are creating them are people like us in HR who are creating them. They're creating them because they personally, same as us, would have loved to have it. So if you're not part of an HR community right now, go out and join one, because the magic happens through them. And then, absolutely. Yeah. And then what Jules said also, bring in other people, go to event like your event, Kirsty, amazing. You go to these things, you hear people talk about it, invest time in it. You tell your people, you go out to all the people you support in your organization, and you say, invest time in upskilling and networking. Well, go out and do it yourself. Completely changes who you are and what you can accomplish.
Massively. And I was the world's worst networker back in the day. I hated it, like really shy. I mean, I know I don't come across as an introvert, but I really am. And in-person networking events were my idea of it was horror. It was like a horror movie for me. And I would, speed wine drinking, because I said to myself, I can go home after one glass of wine and then I'd go glug so I could go home. But one thing I want to say is that when I talk about communities, so there are paid communities, there are free communities, there are Facebook groups that you'll find useful, there are Facebook groups you will not find useful, but there's a lot out there. And, this is not a sales pitch, because the Evolving HR app is free. Look in it, search for communities in there. We have tons in there. So I'm a member of a few HR communities still, even though I don't work in HR anymore, just because I love those groups of people. And I see the support and the value that people are getting from those groups of people. It's wonderful. And people generally are they're so giving in terms of their time and their advice and their support, that it's lovely. It's really lovely. And I've seen, there have been people who are dealing with, it might be a work-related problem that is like they really don't know how to navigate it. It's awful. And everybody will kind of pile in with the, hey, have you thought about this? And that kind of thing, just to not feel, it's to take away the isolation and the vulnerability that Neil talked about, basically.
Yeah.
So yeah, please do, look at the directory, look on Facebook, find your people, find the people that can kind of be that sounding board for you and that support.
And Claire's just said, still my idea of hell, I always linger by the drinks and snacks, which made me smile, because I completely understand that. But what I would say is that, that even when you're lingering by the drinks and snacks, you'll find that there's a collection of us doing that too. So actually, that's okay. They're your people.
I know Claire, actually. I think Claire and I were both lingering by the drinks and snacks at the HR Big Meet in May, if I'm right, weren't we, Claire? Like right at the back by the biscuits. I think that's where we were.
But you know what? What I do is I give myself a goal, because I am definitely, I wouldn't even be by the snacks. I'd be in the hallway near nobody. And I give myself a goal of, I'm going to meet 3 new people, or I've got this one problem and I'm going to go find 5 people to help me with it. Because if I don't have a goal, I will just hide the entire time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just to pick up from what Deborah was saying just then and before, actually, about I think knowing being clear what you need as well. She was talking, Deborah, you were talking about upskilling before, so it might be the thing that you need is to learn how to speak and put in boundaries with the boss. It might be how to negotiate conflict. It might be knowing when to leave. It might be looking after yourself. It could be a whole range of different things, or just getting out and having a good night out once a week, whatever it is. If you're able to kind of know in yourself what it is that you'd like to do to make the difference, so you're not feeling stuck in this toxicity bubble, then that's a really good first step. I think that helps linger, speaking as a lifelong lingerer.
Yeah, I agree. So in terms of things like, coping strategies, coping with stress and building resilience, what would you suggest there, Deborah? Any thoughts around how to kind of better equip yourself, I suppose?
Probably, since I just told you about goals, you can probably tell I'm a very goal-oriented person. I think for me, stress normally happens when I feel like things are out of control. And that's when things just throw me over the edge. So the more I am like the list person. I've got lists, I've got posters, I've got Post-its. So for me, that is my coping method. Besides well-being, which I know, Jules, you talked about. For me, it's just putting some order in my life and that way it's like, it's not as bad as I thought it was.
Yeah. Anyone else? Thoughts around resilience and coping with stress? Neil?
Again, thinking about the internal work. Self-care is a big topic for people at the moment, but what does that really mean? And it is taking time to stop. If it feels like you need to speed up, slow down. If it feels like you absolutely can't leave something, leave it. Listening to past the voice that's shouting in your head to what your gut is saying in terms of what it is you actually need in order to be kind to yourself. And there's lots of mindfulness stuff that people can do, and I'm happy to do meditation stuff at a different point if that'll be helpful. But I think a crucial one that's really easy to do is tune into what your body's saying and where the body is tense, and just to bring in the same kind of playful kindness that you would do if it was your child, if you're a parent, or if you're like me and I've got 2 massive fur babies out on the rug here, my 2 doggies. The kind of really kind of gentle care, and aim that at yourself, give it to yourself, and then give it to other people. Because if we get stuck with ourselves, then we're not actually solving the situation.
Fair. It's really interesting that, in a conversation about navigating a toxic workplace, nearly everything we're talking about is how we do things ourselves rather than what we do with that workplace, with that culture. So that's a question I want to throw out there. And I know we talked about this when we had our pre-meet, because, we all had a fairly sort of different idea on it. But can they be fixed? Can toxic cultures be fixed? Can toxic individuals be fixed? And I'm going to come to you on that, Jules. Like, have you ever seen anyone who was a really nasty piece of work change and become a good manager? So I guess, you know, the purpose of the question is, are we fighting a losing battle by trying to change them? Is it all about how we respond to it ourselves? Or is there evidence out there for step change in organizations?
Yeah, I don't think it's all about how we respond to it ourselves. In terms of a toxic culture, can that be changed? Yes, I absolutely believe that can be changed. It's typically why I've been called in on repeat to go and do exactly that. But that comes from the top, and it comes from the leader, and it comes from the core values of that leader, and making sure that there is zero tolerance for the yuck stuff. And that's kind of, you know, upheld. And that is not a quick turn. That takes time. And so you can go through that and change that. Can it be done? Yes, I've done it several times. Now, where I think we're in a different territory is if you don't have that type of leader. And I wrote a paper on seductive operational bullies. So basically workplace psychopaths. And so, they present as high performers, high achievers, real like, woo. And the seductive part, yeah, you know, let's make everybody love me. And then it's absolute hell. And so where I think that there's a challenge is if that's the makeup of the organization and the DNA. So you need the leader that has zero tolerance for toxicity, that will do all the things that we've spoken about. One of the most phenomenal people that I've ever worked for, I did this alongside him actually, and he was great. He was so tuned in to the employee base that if you were doing something that was really quite intense, he'd be like, have a self-care day. And he would love to see like, oh, you know, today I went and played golf. Today, you know, I walked along the river or whatever that was. That wasn't holiday. That wasn't sickness. That was just go out and get yourself some fresh air or do whatever you need to do with it. So, yeah, but if you have somebody saying one thing and their actions don't marry with that, and that's your leader, that's where I think you have a personal decision to make. And if we've got a whole room full of those shouty people that you were describing earlier, you know, if that's not your environment that you want to roll with and it runs interference with your moral compass, run as fast as you can, you know, go and get yourself a job with your people. Don't try and put that mask on and be somebody that you're not all day long. It's exhausting. And you'll break along the way. Nobody needs that.
No, they absolutely don't. It's interesting. I noticed that Hannah had left a comment lower down about how she's resigned from a job recently, and she's got a 6-month notice period, bless her, because of a toxic culture. And it's that I think sometimes also, I don't know how long Hannah put up with this for before she made that decision to go, but I do think it takes us a very long time to get to that point sometimes. And if we could shortcut it, it would be, for me, look at the top.
Yeah, 100%.
Because if the top is toxic, it ain't going to change. You know, if it's just one individual and you think you might be able to win around the CEO, then it might be worth sticking it out. But if that's where it's coming from, you know, my record's 10 months. I got out of a job after 10 months because it was the CEO that was this is the guy that I held my hand up to. It was him. And he loved doing that to everybody. So I was like, this ain't going to change. I am out of here. And I left with no job to go to because it was just like, it's either that or I lose my mind. And my mind's too important. So I left.
And I hear you. And I mean, I've done that too. And it's a horrible situation to be in. And then I think we've got to be really careful where we, you know, can quite easily say, oh my God, you know, that person's a nightmare and it's completely toxic. And where I've seen that is in organizations where you have a mix of cultures and actually they weren't toxic whatsoever. You know, they were from Brazil working in English language and trying to express themselves and frustrated. They were an absolute I mean, don't get me wrong, they would, it was very black and white, but put them in pussycat mode, which you can absolutely get to. They weren't toxic. So it's just a case of then working to help others understand and some education. It's like, we're all different. They probably think you're being really rude when you do this over here. So
that's a good point, actually.
Yeah. So sometimes we hear that phrase and that's not it. So yeah.
I was just going to say that's why I think that it all has to start with awareness. So we don't have time for my story, but if I think of one of my bad boss stories, it was me coming from the US, managing a European team, just not even being aware of how horrible I was and the toxic environment that I caused. So although I do think that 5% of these people will never change, I genuinely think that if we could do more to create awareness. And normally I say awareness, acceptance, and action, but I think accountability also, what you guys said. So you personally take accountability, and then your company's like, we'll give you the tools, you change. And then if not, then we have the courage to exit them. But yeah, it has to, I just did an HR or Disrupt HR talk on awareness. It's like, it begins with awareness.
I mean, in your talk, because Jules and you were at the Great Geek together as well. We were, and Deborah was speaking at the Michelle Hartley's Great Geek together the other week in Birmingham. And Deborah's talk was really powerful. Deborah and Ken, Ken, you were there too. It was really powerful, talking about exactly this kind of thing. And one of the things, and I can't remember for the life of me who it was, so I'm going to come back onto self-care again for just to wrap things up, because it does come up an awful lot. There was, you two might remember, who was it on the day that said, aftercare is not self-care?
I wrote that down. I can't remember. I loved that. I loved it.
Yes. I can't remember who it was, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. And I was like, oh my God. The number of times that I've thought, I've had a really crappy week, like I'm at my lowest ebb, I'll have a self-care day. And it's like, it's not a sticking plaster. You have to be proactive.
It's like putting sunscreen on instead of what you put on after you burn. What's that?
It was cold.
Yeah,
of course it was, Nicole. I mean, it's just
it's right
so
though, isn't it?
Yeah.
And at the risk of sounding like really crazy or woo-woo, I mean, I book a sound bath every single month. I'm really responsive to sound, and it's literally kind of puts you out and under for a while, and I come out fully energized and ready to go again. But that's booked. That isn't something that I do after I feel wrung out. That's something
regardless of how you're
feeling. That just kind of happens.
And I think this is part of the problem with these labels and these titles like self-care and turning them into a thing. It's not, if it's just part and parcel of our lives, we wouldn't be giving it a label or a title. But like the word toxic, I know we had that conversation, when we at the pre-meet, and me having kind of a problem with the way the word toxic's stuck on everything as well. We keep putting these ideas into our heads. We're gonna keep doing them. So if it's a thing we do, looking after ourselves without a name, and without a great project about it either, and if it is aftercare, if that's the only time we've been able to do it, also letting ourselves off the hook with that as well. There's so much pressure to do self-care right at the moment. It's like just stop, So I think anything that we're doing where we're recognizing we're being kinder to ourselves and more gentle, let's get to the stage where we're not having to notice it. So it's unconscious competence, for want of a better phrase. That's again, like I said,
no, you're absolutely right. And like I said at the beginning, it's different for everybody. So I know a lot of people use yoga. That's my idea of hell. I have zero coordination. I cannot follow instructions from someone on a screen. I would end up tied in some sort of reef knot. But I know that for a lot of people, that is their ultimate self-care thing. Mine is different. I go for a walk every day. I burn incense in my office. I love a bit of woo-woo just like the next person, but yoga is not my thing. This is going to sound random. I'll listen to death metal. That calms me down. I'm weird, but that's my thing. And everybody has.
No, Kirsty, I get that. And isn't it interesting we use the word woo-woo, which is a denigrative phrase for something that's making us feel better. That's the society we live in. we are so judgmental even when we think we're not being. It's incredible.
Yeah, I know. Oh, I've been so judgmental of myself. You know, I have a little table over here that's got like a load of crystals and things on it, and it's like, those are just things that make me feel nice. I like it.
Yeah.
So that's,
Yeah.
I think at the core of it, it's anything that makes you feel the most like you and the most at peace. Whatever that looks like for you, that's your self-care.
Yeah.
Gosh. Neil, I know there's a questionnaire that you're doing right now, and you wanted to put a link have you got a link in the chat that you could paste into the chat?
Yeah,
Neil's
I've got
doing
it right
some
here.
research at the moment, so
so my journey as a coach has kind of led me to this point where I've ended up just kind of stuck at the HR door because I can't believe the stories I'm hearing on the road to trying to kind of, just talking to companies. So at the moment, me and a colleague, we're really trying to gauge and get a real feel for what is going on in the ground, because I think where I'm at is can't help any companies and do any of the other work I want to do until I know the people who are having to deal with all of this have got some support to start with. So I'm kind of on a mission about this. So I'm just going to try and paste that now. Kirsty, thank you for reminding me as well.
No, you're very welcome. If anybody who's watching this, either live or in the recording, feels like they've got a few minutes to complete this questionnaire for Neil, it would be really, really helpful.
Really
it's obviously not going to
appreciate it.
cost you anything. It would be great to have your input to that. So thank you, all of you. I do feel like we could probably do 10 of these and cover different ground, because it's such a big topic. And thank you to those of you that listened in and asked questions. I hope you found it useful. If there's anything else that you would like to hear about, please drop me a note. You can reach me through direct message on LinkedIn, or pop me an email if you've got my email address. Because we want to make sure that all of these conversations that we have are things that the HR community want to know more about. So, and again, please feel free to reach out to any of us today if you've got questions, or if you could do with some help in this kind of area. But thanks to all of you for joining me, my lovely guests. And we'll let everybody go and enjoy their evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.